abolition of the slave trade and slavery is a pivotal chapter in world history, symbolizing a monumental shift in the moral and social fabric of societies involved in these practices. This movement took place over the course of centuries, driven by a variety of factors including moral, political, and economic changes, with some regions taking the lead while others followed later. The slave trade and its impact. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most heinous and profitable systems in world history, spanning from the 16th to the 19th century. It involved the forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas, where they were sold as slaves to labor on plantations, in mines, and in households. The slave trade was an integral part of the global economy, with European powers such as Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal at the forefront, trading manufactured goods for slaves primarily from West Africa to be used in the New World. The conditions of the slave trade were unimaginably brutal. Africans were captured, often in violent raids by other Africans, and sold to European slave traders. Once aboard the slave ships, the captives faced horrific conditions during the Middle Passage, where they were chained together and forced to endure overcrowding, disease, and malnutrition. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did were sold in markets across the Americas, becoming commodities to be bought and sold without regard for their humanity. The emergence of abolitionist movements. By the late 18th century, the movement to abolish the slave trade began to gather momentum. Several factors contributed to the rise of abolitionist sentiment, including changing philosophical ideas about human rights, growing awareness of the inhumanity of slavery, and the growing influence of anti-slavery groups in Europe and the Americas. The Enlightenment era, which emphasized the value of human rights, equality, and the dignity of individuals, played a significant role in the development of abolitionist ideas. Philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, and John Locke argued for the inherent rights of all people, which directly challenged the morality of slavery. These ideas were particularly influential in Europe and North America, where they found a sympathetic audience among intellectuals, religious leaders, and political reformers. In Britain, the abolitionist movement gained significant ground in the late 18th century. The Quakers, a religious group known for their commitment to social justice, were among the first to take up the cause of abolition. They formed the first abolitionist group in Britain, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, in 1787. This group, along with other activists, began to organize petitions, public demonstrations, and campaigns to raise awareness about the horrors of the slave trade. One of the most influential figures in the British abolitionist movement was William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament who led the parliamentary campaign to end the slave trade. Wilberforce and his allies, including Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp, worked tirelessly to expose the brutality of the slave trade and to persuade lawmakers to pass legislation to end it. They collected evidence of the inhumane conditions on slave ships, interviewed former slaves, and lobbied politicians to pass a bill to abolish the trade. The abolition of the slave trade in Britain. The efforts of abolitionists in Britain came to fruition in 1807, when the British Parliament passed the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. The law made it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British Empire, effectively ending Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. This victory was a major milestone in the fight against slavery and set a precedent for other nations to follow. The abolition of the slave trade in Britain was not the end of the struggle against slavery. Many abolitionists continued to push for the complete abolition of slavery itself, particularly in the British colonies, where slavery continued to exist even after the slave trade was abolished. These efforts culminated in the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which emancipated all slaves in the British Empire. Abolition of the slave trade and slavery in other countries. The abolition of the slave trade spread to other parts of the world, albeit at a slower pace. In France, the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity led to the abolition of slavery in 1794, although it was later reinstated by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802. However, the French colonies in the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, played a crucial role in the global abolition movement. In 1791, a successful slave revolt in Haiti led to the establishment of the first independent black republic, which abolished slavery in its territories. The Haitian Revolution was a powerful symbol of resistance to slavery and inspired abolitionist movements worldwide. In the United States, the abolition of slavery was a long and bloody struggle. The abolitionist movement in the U.S. gained momentum in the early 19th century, with key figures such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison leading efforts to end slavery. These abolitionists used speeches, writings, and the Underground Railroad to mobilize public opinion against slavery. The debate over slavery in the U.S. reached its peak in the 1860s, leading to the American Civil War. The Union victory in 1865 led to the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States. While the end of slavery was a momentous victory, it did not immediately grant equality to African Americans, and the struggle for civil rights continued for many years. The abolition of slavery in Brazil and the last holdouts. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. The practice continued there until 1888, when the Golden Law, Lei Áurea, was signed, officially ending slavery in Brazil. The delay in abolition was due to the country's heavy reliance on slave labor in its economy, particularly in the coffee and sugar industries. The abolition movement in Brazil was led by both Brazilian abolitionists and former slaves who fought for their freedom. However, it was not until economic and social pressures coupled with international pressure from Britain and other countries that Brazil finally ended slavery. Legacy of the abolition movement. The abolition of the slave trade and slavery marked a significant turning point in world history. The moral, political, and economic changes that led to the end of slavery laid the foundation for the expansion of human rights in the modern era. Abolitionists challenged the deeply ingrained beliefs and practices that had justified slavery for centuries, and their efforts helped to reshape the global understanding of freedom, equality, and justice. The end of slavery also had profound social and economic consequences. The abolition of the slave trade disrupted the global economy, particularly in the Americas, where slave labor had been integral to the plantation economy. The end of slavery led to the rise of wage labor and the restructuring of agricultural and industrial economies. However, the legacy of slavery and the racial inequalities it perpetuated did not disappear with abolition. In many countries, including the United States, former slaves faced continued discrimination and segregation, and the struggle for racial equality and civil rights would continue for generations. The abolition of the slave trade and slavery remains one of the most significant achievements in the history of human rights, but it is also a reminder of the deep scars left by this practice. It is essential that we continue to remember the horrors of slavery and work toward a world where such practices are never repeated. The abolition of the slave trade and slavery was not a singular event, but rather the culmination of a long and complex struggle for human rights. The efforts of abolitionists, former slaves, and moral leaders brought an end to one of the most dehumanizing practices in history. While the end of slavery did not immediately resolve the racial injustices that followed, it marked a critical step toward a world in which freedom, equality, and human dignity are recognized as universal rights. The abolition movement continues to inspire modern struggles for justice, and its legacy endures as a testament to the power of collective action against inhumanity.